Hugh, any other questions before I let people in so they don't hear us chatting?
I'll mute myself again for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, perfect. We've got the chat anyway. We've got the presenter chat on the right hand side, which we can use for us. So
Brilliant.
That way.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody. Thank you for arriving so promptly. We've still got 5 minutes before we start, so please feel free to go grab a tea, coffee, something to eat while we wait, okay? So see you in 5 minutes. Okay, hello, good afternoon, teachers of Romania. Thank you ever so much for joining us this evening. It's great to see so many of you with us. So let me introduce myself first of all. My name is Alex Warren, and I work as a senior academic consultant for National Geographic Learning, and I will be your host this evening. So I'm going to sort of make sure everything runs as smoothly as possible. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping, okay? Now, I'm hoping it all runs smoothly, but we do have a record number of registrants today. We have over 3,000 people registered, and we have a capacity of 1,500 in the room, and that may or may not cause the platform just to slow down a little bit, okay? So just please bear with us if that is the case, and we'll sort of try to manage that as best we can. If you do have any issues with the streaming, with not seeing the video, having issues with the sound, a lot of the time people hear an echo. Now, this is very often because you're logged in twice. So just make sure you are only logged in once. And if you do have continued issues, our general advice is to log out and then log back in again using the link that you got. Alternatively, you could watch it via the YouTube link as well, which I'm going to ask Clara to pop into the chat box for me, just in case you have any issues viewing through the Adobe Connect platform. Okay, other things to make a note of. This session is being recorded, okay, which means that we will send a link to the recording post-webinar. So if for any reason you have to dash off before Hugh finishes, or if your connection goes down, don't worry, you'll get that link to the recording. Equally, you'll also have a certificate sent to you post-webinar by the team at Fisher International, who are bringing you the webinar today alongside National Geographic Learning. And for those that don't know, Fisher International are the exclusive partners of National Geographic Learning in Romania, and we will share all their contact details at the end. Okay, enough of that. It's time to introduce our speaker for today. So, I'm going to introduce the marvelous, the charming Mr. Hugh Deller, who is the founder of Lexical Lab and co-author of Outcomes, as well as being co-author of Perspectives. But really, he needs no introduction. I think his reputation precedes him. So, Hugh, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And good evening to everybody in Romania. When I was chatting earlier to Alex and to Clara, and they told me how many people had registered, I have to say I did have a moment of quick terror at the prospect of 3,000 people waiting for me to say something intelligent about language teaching. I should begin with a confession, which is actually I'm on the last day of a family holiday. We're slowly coming out of lockdown here in the UK. And as part of coming out of lockdown, we're now allowed to get out of the city. And so we've rented a little tiny cottage in the middle of nowhere in the East Sussex countryside. And it's very lovely, but I'm also on very, very shaky Wi-Fi. So I'm kind of hoping and praying that the Wi-Fi holds out. So, here's hoping that we can manage to get through the hour. Thank you all very much for joining us and for National Geographic and Fisher for organising the whole event. It's really nice to be able to talk and work with so many teachers from Romania again. It's been a while since I was out there. What I'm going to be talking about today really is something I often think about in terms of language teaching and also as a language learner, to be honest, which is what is it we do as teachers and as learners ourselves, because I'm guessing most of you out there are also, learners of foreign languages. What is it we do as learners and as teachers to help us get to grips with the language that we're learning or that we're teaching? And is the way in which we're trying to deal with things maximally efficient? Are we thinking about things in a way that benefits us to the maximum, if you like? And there may be, you may have noticed a kind of clue in the title here about spacing out in praise of distributed practice. Now, if you're looking at that, I'm not sure what that means. Don't panic, because that's what we're going to be covering in the next sort of 45 minutes or so. I will also be leaving time at the end for any questions that anyone might have, okay? So if you do have questions, either pop them in the chat box and Alex and Anka and Clara can keep an eye on them and we'll come back to them later, or just hold on to them and we'll deal with the questions at the end as we get to them, okay? So I'm going to begin this whole talk with a rather strange metaphor, okay? And this might not be what you were expecting from a talk about English language teaching. But I'm going to begin by talking about basketball, okay? I don't know how much you know about basketball. I used to play a bit of basketball as a kid, which was helped by the fact that I'm 6'4", 1 meter 93. So I was either put in goal when I was playing football, or I was sort of encouraged to play basketball as a kid. And I've always kind of maintained a passing interest in basketball, although it's not my main sport or the main sport that I really follow. The reason I'm mentioning it will become clear as I go through. But for those of you who don't know anything about basketball, what you can see in this particular picture here on this slide is an example of a player taking what's known as a free throw. Okay, basically it's an unopposed attempt to put the ball into the net through the hoop that you can see there. Okay, the free throws are always taken from this particular point, which is called the free throw line, which is 15 feet away from where the actual net is. And a free throw is awarded after a foul. When you look at really good basketball players, say you take something like the NBA, okay, in America, the National Basketball Association, sort of generally regarded as the world's best basketball league. Your average player in the NBA will convert 70 to 80% of their free throws, okay? So across a season, the average player, let's say 75% of the time, will throw the ball from that standing space 15 feet away from the hoop, through the net, and get 1 point. The highest scoring players at free throws in the NBA average a much, much higher conversion rate. Excuse me, I'm just going to pour myself a cup of tea while I'm talking. They average a much, much higher conversion rate. They will average between 90 and 93% at the top end of the throws that they take across a season. Now, one of the strange things about basketball is it's usually a very high scoring game, and it's also usually a game of very narrow margins. So you get scores like 101 against 103. And, you know, in that kind of 200 point plus kind of game, just scoring a couple of free throws across the whole period of the basketball game can make the difference between victory and defeat. Okay? So when you think about it like that, you realize that if you can increase your percentages in your views from, say, 72% to 85%, across a whole season, that improvement in conversion rate will make a huge difference to your team's success. Unsurprisingly, there's been a lot of research into how teams can best improve their free throwing. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, let me just move back a little bit there. How teams can best improve their free throwing. And because basketball's such a kind of big money game these days, a lot of the big basketball teams and the NBA itself have funded research into how teams and how individual players can up their statistics, how they can increase their competence at converting free throws. You might be looking at this thinking, well, what is there to research? Surely, if you want to get good at converting your free throws, you just have to practice, practice, and practice some more. We have this expression in English, possibly in your language too, that practice makes perfect. And we have this very deep-rooted belief that all we need to do to become more proficient, more competent at something is this kind of focused, reactive, and repetitive practice. And this is what's known as massed practice. Okay, if you imagine that the way that you tried to improve your free throwing was to just stand there at the 15-foot space, at the 15-foot line, and just do throw after throw after throw after throw after throw in order to improve your conversion rate, what you would be doing is what's called massed practice. Okay, you're massing into one condensed block the practice of one particular element that makes up competence. And this idea of mass practice, this idea of practice making perfect, I think is so deep rooted in the way we think about competence in many areas of life. Obviously, not just basketball, because this isn't going to be a talk about basketball. It's going to be a talk about developing competence and developing linguistic skills. But this idea of massing the practice of one particular thing until you master it and then moving on to mass the practice of another area of the competence that you want to build up is so deep rooted in our general framework for thinking about how we get better at things that maybe we don't stop to think about whether there are other ways of thinking about competence, and maybe we don't stop to think about whether or not massed practice is the best way to build up your competence. And I'm going to be suggesting that actually the idea that massed practice makes perfect is a little bit of a myth as it happens. We have this kind of faith in focused, repetitive... Oh, sorry, one second. What's happened there? Why it's doing that? Seems to be some kind of timer or something. One second. Let me see if I can just sort that out. Wasn't doing it earlier. Oh, thank you. Okay. So, sorry, scared me a little bit there. We have this faith in sort of focused, repetitive practice. And as I said, we kind of believe that if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again until we nail it, until we absolutely perfect it, that's the only way that we can get to this kind of point of perfection. And because of this deep-rooted faith we have, it means that we rarely stop to ask if there may be other ways in which we approach things. What's interesting is when you look at the research into basketball, okay, and how the top players move from 70 to 80 to 90 to 93% conversion rates, it's not through massed practice. If you do massed practice in basketball, if you stand there 15 feet away and you practice throwing the ball through the hoop 100 times, say, what you then see is there will be a significant improvement immediately afterwards in your conversion rate. So say you were to spend half an hour just standing on the 15-foot line, practicing, and then after that half an hour, you had 10 free shots, okay? Probably your conversion rate would be higher after that half an hour of mass practice. The next day, however, there would be a rapid fall off, and what you would find is you were basically back to where you were before you did your mass practice. So mass practice produces noticeable, significant improvements in the immediate aftermath of the massed practice. But then there's this rapid decline back to where you already were before you did the massed practice. If you then thought, well, okay, what I'd better do is more massed practice. I'd better do another half an hour of just standing on the 15-foot line and doing my targeted free throws and then see what my stats are like afterwards. Well, what you'd notice is after doing the further massed practice, your conversion rate would go up again. In the immediate aftermath, in the immediate time after that massed practice. But again, the next day, if you were to go back without further practice and just do more free throws, you'd find that your statistics were back where they had been before any of the massed practices that you've been engaged in. And what's interesting is, excuse me, the way that players actually get better is to not just practice from the 15-foot line. Excuse me. One thing that they found is if you vary the distance, you get better at free throws. So what this means is, say you want to practice your free throws. You do a couple of free throws from the 15-foot line, and then maybe you move back a couple of feet and do some from 17 feet. Then you go some from 23 feet back. Then you do a couple from 11 feet. Then you try 13 feet, 14 feet, 20 feet, a couple more at 15 feet. And if you do this, interestingly, two things actually happen. One is you get better at free throws, okay? But the second thing is the improvement sticks much more. So they've done these kind of contrastive tests where they will basically get one group of players to practice only throwing the ball from 15 feet into the hoop over and over and over again. And they'll test them immediately afterwards and 2 days afterwards or 3 days afterwards. And then they'll have another group where they're shooting from different distances, both closer and further away, as well as 15 feet. And then they'll test them immediately afterwards and 2 or 3 days afterwards. And what they find is both groups improve in the immediate time afterwards, but the drop-off, the tail-off, is far less dramatic, and the development of the skill deeper if you vary where you're practicing from. Okay? So that's one thing. I think it's just recognizing here that massed practice in and of itself isn't what makes the learning stick. It's spacing the practice of the thing that you want to work on out with other things that are similar but slightly different. There's also a second factor which influences the ability of the skill to develop and to be able to connect to other areas of competence, because obviously in a basketball match it's not just about free throws. The same as in a conversation, it's not just about the correct production of one grammatical structure. This is interwoven or interleaved with other areas. And what they found is that if you want even greater improvement, you don't just space out the practice of the one particular skill, you interleave it, or you kind of mix it up with other things. So in terms of basketball, what this might mean is you do 10, 15 minutes of shots from 11 feet, 13 feet, 23 feet, 17 feet, 15 feet, 9 feet, 15 feet, 17 feet. And then you do a little bit of dribbling, a little bit of blocking, a little bit of passing, a little bit of, moving the ball around in different kinds of ways, then a little bit more free practice. And this kind of mixing up the new skill with the old skill basically allows the new skill to kind of bed in with the old skill. And the theory is that it allows you as a learner to explore the subtleties of interaction that make up the new skill in a deeper, more meaningful kind of way. So spacing out and interleaving allows you also, on top of developing the new skill in a deeper, longer lasting, more meaningful way, it also allows you to continue working on and continue developing your previously acquired skills. So you're not just forgetting you ever did those things and working on a new skill. You're basically working on the old skills and mixing the new skills up around that. And in case you're wondering what on earth I'm doing talking about basketball for the first 20 minutes of this session, this very definitely isn't exclusive to ball sports, okay? This operates in many other kinds of areas. In a minute, I'll start talking about how this operates in terms of language teaching and language learning. But first, one more metaphorical parallel. Like many of you, I'm a driver, but I didn't learn to drive until I was 35. I was quite a late starter. And I struggled with driving to begin with, particularly with parking, because I live in North London, in a very hilly part of North London. Here you can see one of the streets that I was often forced to park in while I was doing my driving lessons. And I like driving. I'm an enthusiastic driver, but I've always hated parking, and particularly parking in London, because you've often got quite narrow roads. People park on both sides of the roads. Sometimes there are people behind you beeping you. You don't get much time to concentrate. You're parking under quite a high pressurized, high stress kind of context. And sometimes, even now, after years and years and years of parking and driving, sometimes I'll screw up my parking. I'll mess it up and park badly and have to start again. It's quite frustrating when it happens. When I was learning to drive, I found it probably the most difficult part of learning the skills that I needed to pass my test. And often it was because of the varying factors. So parking on the right is quite different to parking on the left. Parking on a downhill slope is quite different to parking on a flat road or an uphill slope. Parking in an uphill slope on a side of the road I don't usually park on in a very, very tight space, particularly stressful when there's someone behind me beeping me because they're getting impatient. Now, you might be thinking, well, surely you did mass practice. Well, obviously I didn't, because that would be a bit weird if my driving instructor just spent 2 or 3 lessons only forcing me to park, and then we moved on and it never happened again. What actually happened was I did one lesson where my driving instructor explained the basics to me, demonstrated a couple of times how he parked, talked me through it, picked me up on what I was doing wrong, told me how to do it better. And then after that, every single driving lesson I had until I passed my test, first time, luckily at the age of 35, right up until I did my test, basically parking was just integrated or interleaved into everything else I was doing. So we'd do a bit of motorway driving, we'd do a bit of changing gears, we'd do a bit of an emergency stop, we'd do a 3-point turn, we'd do a parking session, we'd then do pulling out and indicating. And it was basically not something that I did mass practice of, other than very early on, where I did a kind of limited amount of mass practice. But even then, it was in different spaces, different sides of the road, different slopes, different amount of space to park in. And then after that, it was just interleaved into everything I did as part of a driving lesson, as a driving learner. Now, the part you've probably been waiting for is, what on earth has all this got to do with me and my students and my teaching? Well, I'm going to suggest that all of what I've been saying is basically the same for teaching and learning foreign languages. I think it's very clear, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the research behind this in a minute, but if you distribute study time of specific structures and items over different sessions rather than trying to cover all aspects of one structure or one item in one particular session. The distributed practice and the distributed exposure leads to better internalization, better integration, and better ability to utilize the language than dealing with everything in one single study session. This is known as the spacing effect, and it was first noted by a German linguist and psychologist in 1885, a man called Hermann Ebbinghaus, who basically did the first scientific studies into memory. And what Ebbinghaus did was very interesting. He basically used himself as the subject of his experiments. And he created these lists of random syllables that had no meaning. So they would be things like lum, mac, nap, etc. Okay? And he would study these 12-syllable lists to see how well he could remember them. And what he found initially was if he studied a list of 12-syllable items 68 times on one day, and then 7 quick times the next morning, he would be able to remember it perfectly. Okay? Quite impressive. Slightly weird way to spend your free time, but quite impressive. He then started distributing or spacing out the practice. And he found that if he distributed the practice over 3 days and still kept this 7 repetitive exposures to the vocabulary before the actual test, he only needed 38 encounters with the list, not 68. So basically, by spreading out the time that he spent on it over 3 days and doing, say, 10 times a day or 12 times a day, rather than 68 times in one day, he cut in half the amount of time that he spent studying the language for the same results. And this wasn't exclusive to Ebbinghaus. So that's just basically explaining what he was doing. The spacing effect has... Oh, sorry. Can we just go back a touch, Alex? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you got to be careful. For some reason, it does that. Do you want to go back or forward?
I'll go to there. Sorry. Yeah. So spacing effect, it's been very consistently proved time and time again. It's one of those bits of research that has stood the test of time. 80 years after Ebbinghaus carried out his first research into memory, another guy called Jeffrey Keppel carried out these tests on students, getting them to remember nonsense syllables, a bit like what Ebbinghaus was doing with things like lum and mac, and linking these to adjectives. So he would say something like, lum equals happy, mac equals anxious, okay? And he would test students' ability to remember, what does lum mean? What does mac mean, etc. And he was very thorough in the way he researched this. Basically, he would let people study the list 8 times, okay? One group would do 8 massed practices with one block of adjectives. The other group would explore it twice a day over 4 days. They were then tested after 24 hours or after a week, okay? What they found was both groups, where one group had studied 8 times in one day and the other group had studied twice a day for 4 days, both groups scored fairly similar scores on the memory test after 24 hours. However, after a week, what they found, perhaps predictably by now, was that the group that had done the massed study scored much, much, much worse than the group that had spaced out their study. And what seemed to be the case from this is, the massed practice produces good results the next day, as does the space practice. But then you get these massive drop-offs a week later, whereas the space practice group or the distributed practice group showed very little getting. The memory seems to be deeper. Now, it may be that there's something seductive about, try and try again. Practice makes perfect. Cram everything into one intensive study session and drill it into the brain. Spacing out maybe feels a bit harder, okay? You're doing a bit less, a bit more often. It may feel less immediately productive, but it does seem like the effort that's required to retrieve the items produces learning which goes deeper, longer lasting learning, and it allows users a more versatile application of the learning later on. And this is an unfashionable thing to say in this day and age, I guess. We often hear people talk about how to gamify learning, how to make learning fun, how to make learning stress-free and no effort. Well, the fact is, when learning is harder, it's stronger and it lasts longer. Learning that requires a bit more effort goes deeper and produces better results. So taking out the difficulty from any kind of learning might seem like an intuitively sensible thing to do, but might not actually be something which benefits our learners, okay? This was all done on vocabulary, and there are countless other studies into how vocabulary is learned and retrieved and, reorganized in the brain and remembered and repeated over time that bear out these findings. There's been fewer tests of grammar learning, but the tests that there have been basically reveal the same result. When you study grammatical structures over time, it results in more stable, longer-lasting gains than doing massed practice of one structure in one time, at one time situation. So, I think as a result of all of this, it's probably worth us asking how these findings guide the practice of English language teaching. You might be thinking, well, it seems like there's a lot of evidence to support spacing out practice of things. So surely English language teaching reflects this. The materials that we're given to use in the classroom reflect this. This is what you might be thinking. However, you'd be sadly disappointed because by and large, I think, the biggest selling books in the English language teaching world remain very much enthralled to, very much obsessed with this idea of massing the practice of grammar structures. So what you get in most course books is presentations of one particular grammatical structure carefully crafted to not include other items. And I'm sure you've all seen these kind of presentations in course books. You see these slightly surreal dialogues where everybody only asks and answers using one particular structure. So you see things like, where are you going to go for your holidays? We're going to Norway. No, you're not. You're not going to go to Norway. We're going to change your holiday. We're going to send you to Florida. Woohoo! We're not going to go to Norway. We're going to go to Florida. Or you see things like, I've got a headache. What should I do? You should not panic. You should not cut your head off. You should take aspirin. Oh, how many aspirin should I take? You should not take 20. You should take 2. Every hour for the next 4 hours. Thank you. And as teachers, we then go into the staff room saying, hey, I did should today. I did be going to today. Tick. We've massed the practice of that particular structure. Let's move on and do mass practice of another structure tomorrow. As I said, I think you see frequently just laughable dialogues that mass the exposure to first person, second person, third person, singular, plural, positive sentences, negative sentences, questions in these kind of dialogues without any other structures appearing at the same time. And you're forced as a student or as a teacher to basically look at all forms, positive, negative questions, first, second, third, singular, plural, irrespective of your communicative needs. So, when you're an elementary student, you basically need to understand, where are you from? I'm English. Where are you from? Oh, Romania. Oh, right. Whereabouts? Yash. Do you know it? Yeah? What you actually end up learning is Dracula is not Brazilian. Dracula is Transylvanian. We are not Polish. We are German. They are not Argentinian. They are Spanish. Irrespective of the fact that you won't ever need to tell people most of these sentences, the idea is you have to practice all forms because we're massing practice in one big block. You then get freer practice, which is usually less a conversation, as you or I might recognize a conversation, and more a trap designed to elicit common errors that can then be corrected en masse by the teacher. Okay, so each student gets a medical problem that they walk around with saying, I've got a bad back, what should I do? Or each student walks around saying, where are you going to go on your holidays? No, you're not. I'm going to change your holiday. You're going to go to, Finland, okay, or whatever. And again, that's a very peculiar form of practice because it's practicing in an isolated little bubble that doesn't really resemble normal communicative use. What then happens is even more bizarre, which is that structure vanishes from view until the next level where you go through it all over again. So you do one big block of it, one massed practice of it, and then you never see it again until the next level. And maybe what might happen is, as a teacher, you realize that your massed practice hasn't worked. You think, God, I thought we'd done the present perfect simple in our 3-lesson block, only looking at the present simple, but they still haven't got it. So I better do some more massed practice. And maybe you do another alternative kind of presentation. You do another, massed grammar practice activity photocopied from a different grammar book. Maybe you do a different kind of grammar game. And you still get frustrated because the gain doesn't stick. It doesn't last because mass practice doesn't lead to competence. Massed practice does. And what I worry about, I guess, is that as teachers, we spend too much time worrying about the wrong things. We gorge on what Scott Thornberry once called grammar McNuggets, these little chunks of unhealthy fast food grammar. Actually, I don't think it's a great metaphor. I think really what we end up being forced to give our students are more like kind of huge foot-wide grammar mega burgers that we force down the students until they feel a bit sick. And as soon as they've half digested that, here's your present simple grammar mega burger. Get that down you, and then I've got the present continuous grammar mega burger. And we stress as teachers about, should we be using an inductive approach to grammar presentation or a deductive approach? How long should our explanation of usage be? How detailed should it be? How best should we give feedback on student error? Sadly, I think the harsh reality is if we're worrying about these things, we're worrying about the wrong things. And it's the same when we're thinking about vocabulary. What you often get in course books is you get these tidy little lexical sets which we present, we test, and we then expect to see and to hear immediate production of. And we've kind of come to think about vocabulary in the same way as we've come to think about grammar. We present it, we get students to practice it, we then expect to hear them produce it. And I think this kind of PPP way of thinking about presenting and getting students to produce the language poisons the way we think about language development. What then happens is we rarely, if ever, meet the items again. If you work with certain publishers, they'll tell you, well, that item was already presented in Unit 5. It can't appear again in the vocabulary in Unit 7. And even if you say, well, this is a slightly different meaning of it or a different collocation that goes with it, it's good for students to re-encounter vocabulary in slightly different ways over time. Nope, it belongs in Unit 3, therefore it can't appear in Unit 7. And so students don't get the chance, or very rarely get the chance, to meet items in repeated exposures with repeated experience over time. They're then cut out from exercises in case they distract the learners or the teachers see them as off topic. In the same way as if you're doing an exercise on the present perfect simple, you're not allowed to see other bits of grammar because they might distract learners or they might be seen as off topic. And as I said, slightly different meanings or usages are kind of cut out, they're excised. And as a result of all of this, sadly, I think, what a lot of ELT material does is it restricts learners. It kind of fences learners in and it limits the potential those learners have. We're slowing learning down if this is the way we're focusing on things. And on a very basic level, we're robbing our students of their precious time. Now, I know that we all come into language teaching for many varied reasons, but I'm guessing not one of you watching out there became a teacher because you wanted to rob students of time. It's not what we're here for, and it's not what we want to be doing. And yet, if we persist with material which is based on this idea of the mass practice of isolated, discrete grammar structures and lexical sets, unwittingly, that's what we're doing. We're robbing our students of their time and we're slowing down learning. So at this stage, you might be thinking, so what's to be done? This is what I want to move on to really, to kind of finish off the whole talk and wrap things up a little bit. The first thing I would say is, if what I've been talking about sounds like books you use or have been using, maybe it's a good time to stop using them, okay? I think it's important for all of us to just stop using course books that impose this invalid, unproven construct on students. If the material that you're using is based on massed practice, stop it, because you're restricting your students, you're limiting their potential, you're slowing their learning, and you're robbing them of their time. Whatever the appeals of books based on mass practice, and there must be many appeals because those are still the books which dominate English language teaching worldwide, I think it's true to say that they're not theoretically valid in terms of the way they present and encourage teachers and students to think about the learning of language because of this massing as opposed to spacing out the learning. They may also be slowing learning, despite the gains you might feel. You might feel, I did my presentation of the first conditional, students did a whole load of exercises, and then they produced it. It was great. I only had to correct a couple of mistakes. Well, you might see gains in the immediate short-term aftermath, but those gains won't stick and they won't be interleaved with other areas of learning. I think instead we need to recognise that there are other principles that could guide us. And as I've been suggesting, I think learning of grammar, of vocabulary, of language, of driving, of basketball, of anything, I think, is best facilitated through presenting new structures alongside old, allowing the new the chance to embed itself with the previously encountered, previously studied. We need to make sure students get repeated exposure to structures over time, because ultimately all of this stuff is learned through exposure, through experience, over time. We need to ensure that the vocabulary students do meet is fully grammaticalized, so that even when they're doing vocabulary, they're getting this covert exposure to grammar that they've already encountered. We need to ensure that vocabulary is recycled, both within and across levels of a series. As the co-author of the Outcomes series, this is something we think about in a lot of detail. Hopefully, those of you who've used the books will notice the attention to ensuring the vocab is encountered, both within units, across levels, within levels, and across levels over time. Just going to give you a couple of examples, okay? This is from the intermediate level outcomes, where we're looking at have you ever been to, okay? You could think of this as, oh, it's present perfect practice. Actually, in this particular exercise, it's literally just practice of have you ever been to, okay? And we look at possible answers, but because this is intermediate and students have already met the present perfect at elementary, at pre-intermediate, it's not new grammar for them. What we try to do is to go deeper and broader into what the students can do with this grammar. And one of the ways we try to do this here is to think about how we use this grammar in normal everyday communication. In this instance, to talk about travel experiences and holidays. So all the students have to do is decide what's the missing word. Is it yes or no? Never. You'll notice in 1 to 10, you get a wide range of other grammatical structures kind of interleaved with the present perfect here. So, no, never. What's it like? No, never. It's supposed to be amazing several times. I might go at the weekend. I've never really fancied it. Present perfect. I'd love to, though. Okay. It's great. You should go. I spent a week there last year. Well, often when we do the present perfect to talk about experiences, we'll have the past simple, as in number 8 here, but we won't have all the other stuff, like I'm going this summer. What tense is it? Present continuous. Good. Why? Arrangement about the future. Good. Just checking. So by thinking about revisiting and re-encountering the language and getting students to do more with grammar they've already encountered, more in terms of their general communicative competence and more in terms of their ability to interleaven the grammar with other bits of grammar, it allows us to produce material like this. So when students then practice, ask your partner 5 have you ever been to questions, it's a similar conversation to a conversation you might have at elementary or pre-intermediate, but because of the extra language that you're being given here, it allows you to use it more fluently, more competently, and in a way which embeds the new with the old. In the same kind of way, we also think about vocabulary. So one of the features of the Outcome series is we have our own tailor-made website called Elt Outcomes. And on there, we have a vocabulary builder. And we also have a space where you can track words across levels and within a level. So say you take the word bother, okay, which first appears in the upper intermediate book on pages 82, 83. There's a little definition. If something bothers you, you worry about it. Excuse the typo there, I've just noticed. You worry about it a lot and you don't like it. It's a verb. You can be bothered about something, bothered by something. There are some examples. Never bothered me that I couldn't cook. Many residents were bothered by the constant noise. It's always rude to people who doesn't know. Don't let it bother you. There's also an adjective, bothered. You can be bothered about something. He doesn't seem bothered about not having a car. And what you then get is, across the book, you see different examples of bother with slightly different shades of meaning met repeatedly across different units, so that as students go through the book, they get this chance to go, there's that word again, sorry to bother you. I can't be bothered to cook. I'm not that bothered about it, whatever. And through that repeated experience and repeated exposure over time, facilitated by the writing, by the material we're providing for students, they get more of a chance to interact and deal with the language than they would otherwise. Okay? So as you can see, there's a further example in upper intermediate, page 116 to 117. If you don't bother to do something, you deliberately don't do it because you don't think it's worth spending time on. He decided not to bother graduating. I didn't even bother to open it. A lot of people didn't bother voting. Okay? Let's move forwards. You can also do this, and I think technology is getting increasingly good at this, through vocabulary apps and vocabulary revision mechanisms. Some of you may have learned in the old days through these kinds of, physical flashcards and things that you used to make yourself. When I was first learning Indonesian, my main foreign language, I had shoeboxes full of all these little cards that I test myself on. Now, obviously, there are apps that can help you with this, but the technology is only as good as examples that go on it. So what I'll often do with my students is I'll make kind of Quizlet flashcards where you give them examples of the words, and on the back you give them the word that you're testing. And you do it in whole sentences, so they get exposure to other bits of grammar, and they get exposure to other bits of vocabulary that they've already studied before. So these are all the same word missing here. They've just opened another of Starbucks just down the road from where I work. So they're meeting the present perfect again. They're meeting just down the road from where I live, from where I work. I can still remember when they opened the first of McDonald's in China. Sorry, excuse me. Do you know where the nearest of Lloyd's Bank is? So you've got this polite, indirect question. Okay? The missing word, obviously, is branch here. And these kinds of cards allow the covert recycling of grammar and vocabulary that students can be re-exposed to as they're testing themselves on the vocab that you've given them. Okay? So I think, again, this is a great use of technology. It's a great use of a simple kind of app like Quizlet. And it's another way of ensuring massed exposure, massed practice over time. So yeah, just one more example. I mustn't forget to call my dad later on today. I better get going. I mustn't be late for this meeting. I mustn't forget to pay my gas bill this week. So again, it's kind of a grammatical chunk that you're looking at. In common everyday examples, you flip the card over. On the back, it tells you branch. On the back, it tells you. Spacing out is always made easier if you have a lot of opportunities to talk. If the speaking that the students do isn't just controlled practice of recently studied items, but meaningful and a bit deeper. If the speaking that we encourage students to do gets them to express new meanings and ideas that maybe they struggle with, so they're kind of stretching to go beyond what they can already do. And I think crucially, as teachers, we have to not always expect students to use language correctly, okay? The focus generally when students speak should primarily be on message and on content, but also as teachers, we need to be keeping one ear open on how to reformulate, how to take what students are trying to say, help them say things better, where we're thinking not only of corrections, but also how they could have said things they were trying to say but didn't. So this is just one example from a board of mine a couple of years ago. This was just after a student speaking slot. I think it was a pre-intermediate group, and the students had been walking around doing a kind of practice activity, and we ended up with this on the board. Let me just check. Yeah, so it was the before, and then through explaining and through eliciting and working with the group. So some of you were saying, so I arrived yesterday, me 2 weeks from now into the future. I will be here. I'm going to be here. Good, for 2 weeks. Or another way of saying 2 weeks, a fortnight. Good, okay? What you end up with is board work a bit like this. Where are we? I'm going to be here. The best thing to do is take your time. Don't rush. You need to go slowly. This is the first time I've been to Sicily. I'd like to go to a museum. Can you recommend anywhere? It's too hot to walk around. Okay? And again, what you get here is one of the great things that we as teachers can give students, which is it's a mishmash of grammatical structures. It's a real mixed bag of vocabulary and grammar interconnected, but it all comes from things my students tried to say. And I think as teachers, we probably are the best way that students can get this massed exposure to and massed experience of grammar and vocabulary in action over time if we're giving examples of vocabulary in this kind of, fully grammaticalized, fully contextualized way. We're thinking about what students are going to do with the language as we give it to them. And we're listening to the students and we're helping them say what they're trying to say better. And through that process, through that experience, they're getting to see how the grammar and the vocabulary they've already studied works in different meaningful contexts over time. So obviously, as a coursebook writer, I can do this up to a point, but you can also do this yourself in your own classrooms, working from your students' output and rephrasing, reformulating, representing their language back. So to wrap up, really, as I said, the act of retrieval and of trying to remember things, I'm not kidding anyone or kidding myself and saying it's easy. It can be difficult, but doing it aids and assists memory and learning. So when I'm eliciting blanks on the board, or when I'm giving my students Quizlet cards to go through and test themselves, I'm not doing that because it's easy. I'm doing it because it helps memory and it helps learning. And because I believe that a little element of difficulty leads to better retention. It leads to longer lasting, deeper, stickier resonance and utility of the grammar and vocabulary that you're encountering. It may not result in immediate short-term gains, okay? That's one thing you have to always bear in mind. It won't be instant and it won't immediately be productive, but over time, it will lead to broader, deeper learning. What this means, I think, is we need grammar taught in smaller chunks, more fully integrated with vocab and with other structures in meaningful contexts, as you saw with the Whoever Been To. We need to be thinking about how our correction and upgrading of student output leads to spaced exposure to vocab and to grammar, not just correction of mistakes. And we need fewer grammar McNuggets or fewer grammar mega burgers. Instead, we maybe need a healthier way of thinking about our grammar input. We need little grammar olives, or if you prefer, some vitamin C with your spacing out. maybe little grammar orange segments like athletes get or footballers get at half time. So I'm going to stop there. Please do check out our website, www.lexicallab.com. We also run an online language school specialising in classes for very high-level non-native speakers. Most of our students are teachers themselves. We offer online teacher development there as well. You can find us on Facebook. We are Lexical Lab Limited, or you can find Hugh Della, Andrew Walkley. Those of you who want to get in touch with questions or problems or whatever, you can email me. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. And please do check out the outcome series, the 6-level outcome series, available in Romania through Fisher, to see how we've tried to space out the practice and the exposure to both grammar and vocabulary within levels and across all 6 levels of the series. Also, do make sure that you check out the National Geographic work, check out the webinars that Nat Geo offer, and check out the blog that Nat Geo offers as well. Okay? So I'm going to stop there. Bang on 1 hour. Let's just see if there are any questions to ask. I wasn't focusing on the chat box, so I may have missed some things.
No, I think there weren't any specific questions at all there, Hugh. Lots of comments. I think sort of agreeing with you with what you're saying and, enjoying the ideas. And certainly I think the talk has given plenty of food for thought about how we actually go about teaching grammar. I think we've all been guilty at one stage or other of our careers of teaching grammar in the way that you are, sort of telling us not to teach grammar. And I think it's always good as teachers to, well, that might well be, but I think, it's always good to have this food for thought to think, well, how can I do it different? How can I improve my students' own learning? Because we have that expression, don't we, where somebody who keeps on doing the same thing the same way and expecting the same results needs to think differently about what they're doing. Exactly. So we do need to sort of consider other ways in which we can approach grammar, approach vocabulary, and certainly this spaced out technique is a different way of approaching it. So for me, plenty of food for thought, and hopefully for everyone here as well. But like I said, if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. While we're keeping an eye on that, just to reiterate that in the next 5 working days, Fisher International will be in touch with all of you. They will send you a link to the recording, and they will also send through the certificate. Okay, please note you will be sent an automated thank you email from Adobe Connect. This is just a thank you, okay, set up by Adobe Connect. That will send tomorrow, I think actually 1 hour after the session, but you'll get the certificate and the recording directly from Fisher International, okay? So please be patient for that. I'm just checking for any questions there. Just lots of praise, lots of thanks for you, Hugh.
Thank you. That's very nice. I actually can't see the chat box myself on my screen, so I'm dependent on you.
Oh, well, in that case, that's really strange. I'm not sure why. It's really peculiar.
There's always one.
Have you changed your view or something, maybe? Well, there's lots of love. Christiane says, an insightful, informative, enjoyable webinar, an hour well spent.
Thank you.
Lots of thank yous. Yeah, lots of love for you. I'm really sorry you can see the chat box. That's really peculiar.
Yeah, sometimes weird glitches like that.
That is a weird glitch. Well, listen, I cannot see any other questions coming through. So I'm just going to wish you all a very lovely evening. I hope that you guys stay safe, stay well. And, fingers crossed that we will be getting to the end of this situation we all find ourselves in. as soon as possible. As you mentioned, in the UK, we're beginning to sort of, come out of lockdown slowly, but fingers crossed it happens sort of globally as well.
Yeah. And if anyone does have any questions, do feel free to email me.
Exactly. Hugh, do you want to let me put your email in the chat box, actually, Hugh.
Yeah,
I know it's on the screen, but I'm going to put it in the chat box as well. letsgolab.com. So yeah, feel free to email Hugh at that address. Okay, well, listen, thank you ever so much for your participation. We've had over 1,100 with us today, so amazing teachers of Romania, thank you. And Hugh, a big thank you to you.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks to everyone at Fisher. Take care.
Bye-bye.